Sarah's fingers trembled as she stared at her phone, the dreaded bank notification glaring back at her. Account balance, $12.47. 3 months behind on rent, a stack of unpaid medical bills from her mother's cancer treatments, and now this. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, surviving on coffee and the stale pastries her manager let her take home from the cafe where she worked double shifts. At 26, this wasn't how she had imagined her life would turn out. Just 2 years ago she had been pursuing her dreams of becoming a teacher, but when her mother got sick, everything changed. Her younger brother Tommy, only 16, depended on her now too, since their father had disappeared after the diagnosis, leaving them with nothing but empty promises and mounting debts. The text from Tommy flashed on her screen, "They're cutting off the electricity tomorrow." Sarah's heart sank even further. She had already pawned her laptop, her mother's wedding ring, and even her teacher certification materials. The cafe job barely covered the groceries, and her second job as a virtual assistant had dried up when her client went bankrupt last month. Now, standing in front of the convenience store at midnight, she wrestled with a desperate decision that went against everything she believed in. Inside, Marcus Chen was finishing up his usual night shift, his mind wandering to the small business plan hidden in his apartment drawer and the rejection letter from the bank he'd received that morning, his fourth loan denial this year. At 42, he had spent the last 15 years working this same register, watching other people chase their dreams while his gathered dust. The store belonged to his uncle, who had given him this job when he first arrived from Taiwan. Back then, it was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to save money for culinary school. But life had a way of turning temporary into permanent, one day at a time. His thoughts were interrupted by the store's regular, old Joe, shuffling in with his newspaper and coffee money counted out in nickels. The elderly veteran had been coming in every night for the past decade, ever since his wife passed away. Tonight, though, something was different. "You look troubled, son," Joe remarked, his weathered face creasing with concern as he noted Marcus's distracted expression. "Still thinking about that fancy restaurant of yours?" Before Marcus could respond, the door chimed again. He noticed Sarah the moment she walked in, mainly because her desperation seemed to radiate off her like heat. There was something about her. The way she kept her head down, how her worn coat hung too loose on her frame, the hesitation in her steps. He had seen that look before, had worn it himself during his darkest days after his wife left him, taking their savings and his self-worth with her. She wandered the aisles aimlessly, picking up items only to put them back, her shoulders growing tenser with each passing minute. Old Joe lingered by the coffee machine, his trained eyes following Sarah as well. Having spent 40 years as a high school counselor before retirement, he had a sixth sense for troubled souls. He carefully poured a second cup of coffee, adding extra cream and sugar. The security cameras caught every movement, but Marcus found himself watching Sarah directly instead, recognizing the weight of impossible choices in her bearing. When she finally approached the counter, her hands were empty, but her eyes were full of unshed tears. "Do you?" she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you happen to be hiring?" The question caught him off guard. It wasn't what he had been expecting, given her behavior. Something in her voice, the mix of desperation and determination, reminded him of his younger sister back home, who had sacrificed everything to put him through school before her own tragic accident last year. Old Joe stepped forward, sliding the extra coffee across the counter toward Sarah. "On me, dear," he said softly, then turned to Marcus with a meaningful look. "You were just saying yesterday how you needed help with the morning inventory, weren't you, Marcus?" It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Joe's eyes held a challenge Marcus couldn't ignore. "Actually," Marcus heard himself say, though they weren't hiring at all, "I could use some help with the morning shift." The words surprised him as much as they did her. He had no authority to hire anyone, and his uncle would probably be furious. His uncle's upcoming visit next week would complicate things further, especially since he was bringing Marcus's ex-wife Lisa with him, a twist of fate that still felt like a knife in his gut. But as he watched hope flicker across Sarah's face, he knew he would figure something out. Sarah's hand shook as she reached for the coffee, her sleeve riding up to reveal fresh burns from the cafe's espresso machine. "I can start whenever you need," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm a quick learner and She was interrupted by her phone buzzing. "Tommy again? Mom's fever is getting worse. The nurse says we might need to go to the ER." The room seemed to spin around her. Marcus watched the color drain from her face as she read the message. Without thinking, he reached under the counter and pulled out his emergency fund envelope. $600 he'd been saving toward his business plan. "Consider it an advance on your first week," he said, sliding it across the counter. Take care of what you need to and we'll sort out the paperwork tomorrow. Sometimes he realized the biggest changes in life come from the smallest moments of compassion, even when they cost us our own dreams. Old Joe nodded approvingly, his own eyes misty with memories of similar choices made long ago. As Sarah clutched the envelope with trembling hands, none of them could have predicted how their lives would intertwine in the coming weeks, or how one desperate night would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just their futures, but the entire communities. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories/videos we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast harsh shadows across Sarah's face as she sat between her brother Tommy and their mother's bed, Marcus's envelope clutched tightly in her hand. The $600 had covered the ambulance and initial treatment, but she knew it was just a temporary solution to a much bigger problem. Her mother, Ellen, drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing labored despite the oxygen mask. The cancer had spread more aggressively than anyone had anticipated, and the experimental treatment they'd pinned their hopes on was well beyond their means. Tommy had dozed off in his chair, his gangly teenage frame awkwardly folded into the small hospital seat. He'd grown so much in the past year, his pants now too short and his shoulders broader, reminding Sarah of their father. The thought brought a bitter taste to her mouth. When was the last time Richard had even called to check on them? The child support checks had stopped coming months ago, right when they needed them most. A soft knock on the door frame drew her attention. To her surprise, Marcus stood there, 2 paper bags in his hands and uncertainty on his face. I closed up early and thought you might need some food, he said, stepping into the room. The gesture was so unexpected that Sarah felt tears welling up again. When was the last time someone had thought about taking care of them? The smell of warm bread and soup filled the small room and Tommy stirred in his chair. As they ate the simple meal, Marcus shared more about himself, his childhood in Taiwan, his dream of opening a fusion restaurant combining his mother's traditional recipes with modern techniques, the scholarship he'd lost when his sister got sick. Sarah found herself opening up too, telling him about her students from her teaching practicum, how she'd been just months away from her certification when everything fell apart. Tommy joined in, his initial shyness giving way to animated descriptions of his photography project at school, the one bright spot in their challenging year. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patel, her kind face serious as she reviewed Ellen's latest test results. The cancer has reached stage 4, she explained gently. There's a new immunotherapy trial that might help, but... She trailed off, glancing at the insurance forms on her clipboard. The unspoken message was clear, it would cost far more than they could ever afford. Marcus listened silently, his mind racing. The restaurant had been his dream for 15 years, but looking at this family he realized some dreams matter more than others. His uncle's visit was in 5 days. If he could convince him to sell the store. But then there was Lisa to consider. His ex-wife's sudden reappearance in his uncle's life wasn't a coincidence. She had always been ambitious, and the store's prime location in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood made it valuable property. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Old Joe appeared, accompanied by several other regulars from the store. Mike the firefighter, Rachel from the diner next door, and even Mrs. Chen from the alterations shop. We heard one of our own needed help, Joe said simply. The group had put together an impromptu care package, but more importantly they brought ideas. Rachel's sister worked for a medical billing advocacy group. Mike knew about firefighter charity funds for families in crisis. Mrs. Chen had connections with local Chinese medicine practitioners who might be able to help manage Ellen's symptoms. As the room filled with voices and suggestions, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just from the practical help being offered, but from the realization that they weren't alone anymore. She caught Marcus's eye across the room, seeing in his expression a similar revelation. Sometimes family isn't about blood, it's about the connections we forge in our darkest moments. But as the night wore on and plans were made, neither of them could have anticipated the storm brewing on the horizon. Marcus's uncle had already landed in New York, 2 days ahead of schedule, with Lisa by his side and papers for a deal that would change everything. And in a law office downtown, Sarah's father was about to set in motion events that would force them all to question what truly matters in life. Dawn was breaking over the city when Marcus returned to the store, his mind heavy with decisions. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. His uncle James stood at the counter with Lisa, both impeccably dressed despite the early hour. The contrast between his ex-wife's designer suit and the store's shabby interior seemed to underscore everything he'd been running from these past 5 years. "Marcus," Lisa's smile was practiced, professional. "Your uncle and I were just discussing the store's potential." The familiar ache in his chest surprised him. Not because Lisa was here, but because for the first time it didn't matter. His thoughts were still with Sarah's family at the hospital, with the way Tommy's face had lit up talking about his photography, with Ellen's quiet dignity in the face of such overwhelming odds. "The store isn't for sale," he said firmly, surprising himself as much as them. James's face darkened. "That's not your decision to make, nephew. The developer's offer is very generous." Across town, Sarah was facing her own confrontation. Her father Richard sat in the hospital waiting room, his expensive watch and tailored clothes a sharp reminder of the life he'd chosen over them. "I can help," he said, sliding over a thick envelope. "But I need you to sign these papers first." Inside was a proposal that made her blood run cold. He wanted full custody of Tommy, claiming Sarah's financial situation made her an unfit guardian. "Think about what's best for him," Richard pressed. "I can give him opportunities you can't." The weight of the last sleepless night pressed down on Sarah as she stared at the papers. Tommy was at school now, probably exhausted but still determined to maintain his perfect attendance. He'd been her rock through all of this, growing up too fast but never complaining. The thought of losing him. "Get out," she whispered, then louder, "Get out." Back at the store, the morning shift was in full swing, but Marcus was barely present. Lisa and James had left, but their words lingered. The developers wanted to turn the whole block into luxury condos. The store, Mrs. Chen's alterations shop, Rachel's diner, all of it would be gone. The community that had gathered at the hospital last night would be scattered. As he mechanically restocked shelves, old Joe appeared with his morning coffee. "You look like a man carrying the world on his shoulders, son." Before Marcus could respond, Mrs. Chen burst in, tears streaming down her face. Her landlord had just doubled her rent. The same thing that had happened to 3 other businesses on the block in the past month. It wasn't a coincidence. Lisa had always been brilliant at corporate takeovers, and James had taught her well. They were squeezing out the small businesses one by one. Marcus's phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "My father's trying to take Tommy. I don't know what to do." His hands shook as he read it. 5 years ago, he'd lost everything by staying silent, by letting Lisa manipulate the situation until he had nothing left. Not this time. The business plan in his drawer wasn't just about a restaurant anymore, it was about preserving a community. Old Joe set down his coffee cup with unexpected force. "You know, in 40 years of counseling, I learned one thing: the right choice is usually the hardest one." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "My daughter's a civil rights attorney. She specializes in community preservation cases." Mrs. Chen wiped her eyes, straightening her shoulders. "My son is in law school. He can help too." As they talked, more regulars filtered in, each adding pieces to a possible solution. Mike the firefighter knew city council members who opposed overdevelopment. Rachel's diner had been featured in local food blogs. She had media contacts. Even the high school students who came in for snacks offered to start a social media campaign. The store had always been more than just a convenience store, it was the heart of the neighborhood. But as Marcus listened to the plans forming around him, his eyes fell on the security cameras. The same cameras that had been watching Sarah that desperate night now held evidence of something much bigger. Lisa's late-night meetings with developers, handoffs of unmarked envelopes, conversations that seemed a lot like intimidation when you knew what to look for. Sometimes the smallest things could tip the balance between right and wrong. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories/videos we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. The immunotherapy trial paperwork sat untouched on Sarah's hospital tray as she tried to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. Her mother's condition had stabilized, but the doctors were clear: without aggressive treatment, they were looking at months, not years. Tommy sat beside her, his homework spread across the small table, but his eyes kept drifting to the custody papers their father had left. "I'm not going with him," he said suddenly, his voice cracking with emotion. "He wasn't there when Mom got sick. He wasn't there when you had to drop out of school. He doesn't get to show up now and act like he cares." Sarah pulled her brother close, feeling his shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. At 16 he was trying so hard to be strong, but he was still just a kid. A knock at the door made them both look up. Marcus stood there with Rachel from the diner, both carrying bags of food. But it was the woman behind them who caught Sarah's attention. A sharp-eyed professional in her 50s who carried herself with quiet authority. "This is my daughter, Jennifer," old Joe said, appearing behind the group. "She'd like to hear about your situation with Tommy's father." As Sarah recounted the morning's events, Jennifer took rapid notes, her frown deepening. "Your father's attempting to exploit a temporary financial crisis to gain custody. It's unethical and likely wouldn't hold up in court, but fighting it will take resources." She paused, glancing at the medical bills visible on the bedside table. "Resources you don't have right now?" Rachel cleared her throat. "That's where we come in. The whole neighborhood's talking about what's happening, not just to your family but to all of us." Meanwhile, Marcus was reviewing security footage in the store's back office, his hands shaking as he copied files to a USB drive. The cameras had caught more than just Lisa's suspicious meetings. There were conversations with other property owners who had suddenly raised their rents, discussions about building code violations that mysteriously appeared after inspections Lisa had arranged, and most damning of all, a late-night conversation where she explicitly discussed using insider information about zoning changes to force sales. Old Joe's voice made him jump. "Found what you were looking for?" The elderly veteran settled into the spare chair, his eyes sharp despite his gentle tone. "Your ex-wife always was too clever for her own good. She forgot the first rule of communities: they have long memories." He pulled out his own phone, showing Marcus a series of photos from the neighborhood's history, celebrations, graduations, weddings, all centered around the store and the surrounding businesses. "Lisa sees property values. We see lives intertwined." Back at the hospital, Tommy had fallen asleep on the small couch while Jennifer reviewed the custody papers. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her father. "Be reasonable. Think about Tommy's future." As if on cue, her brother stirred in his sleep, his photography portfolio falling open beside him. The images spilled out, stunning black and white shots of their neighborhood, capturing moments of both struggle and joy. There was Mrs. Chin helping a young mother hem a dress for a job interview, Mike the firefighter teaching kids about safety, old Joe sharing coffee and wisdom with troubled teens. And there, in several shots, was the convenience store, glowing like a beacon in the early morning light. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face tense but determined. "Sarah, I need to show you something." He handed her the USB drive, explaining what he'd found. As they watched the footage on Tommy's laptop, Jennifer's eyes narrowed. This isn't just about a custody battle or a single property deal anymore. This is systematic displacement of an entire community. And they're leaving a trail. Rachel, who had been quietly observing, suddenly straightened. "My food blog followers have been asking why so many local places are closing. What if we told them? What if we showed them what's really happening?" She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her substantial social media following. People love a good David versus Goliath story, especially when it involves family-owned businesses. Sarah looked around the room, at her sleeping brother whose artistic eye had captured their community's soul, at her mother whose quiet strength had shaped both their lives, at Marcus whose simple act of kindness had sparked a movement, and at these neighbors who had become family. The path forward wasn't clear, but for the first time it felt possible. "We fight," she said simply. "Not just for Tommy or the store but for all of us." What none of them noticed was the young intern at the nurse's station, listening intently while pretending to check charts. Lisa had connections everywhere, and the game they were about to play had rules they didn't yet understand. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought in courtrooms or corporate offices, but in the small moments when ordinary people decide they've had enough. The next 48 hours unleashed a storm. Lisa's corporate machine moved fast once they realized what Marcus had discovered. Health inspectors descended on Rachel's diner with impossible standards. Mrs. Chin received a notice claiming her shop violated multiple building codes. Mike found his firefighter charity foundation under sudden scrutiny for irregularities. But it was the early morning visit from 2 police officers to the convenience store that showed just how serious things had become. "We have a warrant to investigate allegations of selling alcohol to minors," the older officer stated, though his uncomfortable expression suggested he knew exactly what was really happening. Marcus watched helplessly as they confiscated his security footage and computer hard drives. What they didn't know was that old Joe had already helped him upload everything to secure cloud storage the night before. The veteran hadn't survived 2 wars without learning to prepare for every contingency. At the hospital, Sarah faced her own crisis. The intern who had overheard their conversation had reported everything to her supervisors, and suddenly Ellen's doctor was suggesting transfer to a different facility better suited to her needs. The underlying threat was clear. The hospital received significant funding from the same corporate group backing the development project. Even Dr. Patel, who had been so supportive, could only offer an apologetic look as administrative pressure mounted. Tommy proved to be their unexpected ace. His photography portfolio had caught the eye of his art teacher, Mr. Rivera, who happened to be a former journalist. When Tommy shared what was happening, Rivera recognized the bigger story. "This isn't just about one neighborhood," he explained to Jennifer during an urgent meeting in the hospital cafeteria. "This pattern is repeating across the city. But nobody's been able to connect the dots until now." The pieces started coming together rapidly. Rachel's social media posts about the sudden inspections went viral, drawing attention from larger news outlets. Mrs. Chen's son, the law student, discovered that similar development projects by Lisa's company had destroyed 5 other historic neighborhoods in the past year. And Marcus, going through years of store receipts, found evidence of the gradual pressure campaign, systematic harassment disguised as routine business practices. But it was Sarah who made the crucial connection. Reviewing her mother's medical bills, she noticed a pattern in the insurance denials. The same corporate group behind the development owned the company handling their medical coverage. Every denied claim, every transferred patient, every administrative review was part of a larger strategy to pressure vulnerable families out of the neighborhood. The revelation came at a cost. Richard, Sarah's father, showed up at the hospital again, this time with social services in tow. "Your mother needs specialized care," he argued smoothly. "Care I can provide. And Tommy needs a stable environment." The social worker looked sympathetic but firm as she reviewed their situation. No steady income, mounting medical bills, a pending eviction notice. On paper it looked hopeless. That's when Tommy showed them his latest photographs. Images of the community coming together. Neighbors helping neighbors, impromptu meetings in the convenience store, elderly residents sharing stories of the neighborhood's history with young families. And most powerfully, a series of shots showing Sarah working multiple jobs, helping him with homework, caring for their mother, never giving up despite impossible odds. "This is my stable environment," Tommy said quietly. "This is my home." Marcus watched the scene unfold through the hospital room window, his own battle with Lisa momentarily forgotten. The store's morning shift was being covered by volunteers, regular customers who refused to let their community center disappear. Mrs. Chen had set up a temporary shop in Rachel's diner after her building was condemned on suspicious grounds. Mike's firefighter colleagues were conducting their own investigation into the sudden scrutiny of their charity. But it was old Joe who brought the most surprising news. His daughter Jennifer had been up all night tracing corporate records. "Lisa made a mistake," he announced, his weathered face grimly satisfied. "She got careless with the paperwork when she restructured the development company last month. There's a gap in the ownership chain. Technically, the current development contracts might not be legally binding." The revelation sparked hope, but Sarah's tired eyes remained fixed on her mother's medical monitors. Legal victories wouldn't matter if they couldn't get Ellen into the immunotherapy trial. That's when Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd sworn never to use again. "Uncle James," he said quietly, "we need to talk. But this time I'm setting the terms." The meeting was set for midnight at the convenience store, neutral ground, or so they thought. Marcus arrived early, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. Sarah insisted on coming despite his protests, leaving Tommy with their mother and a watchful Mrs. Chen at the hospital. The store's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the empty aisles, making everything feel slightly surreal. James arrived precisely on time, alone, which was the first surprise. No Lisa, no lawyers, just the uncle who had given Marcus his first job in America. His expensive suit looked out of place in the shabby store, but there was something in his eyes that Marcus hadn't seen in years: uncertainty. "You said you had a proposal," James said, his voice carefully neutral. "One that would benefit everyone." Before Marcus could respond, the door chimed again. Old Joe walked in, followed by Jennifer and, most surprisingly, a distinguished-looking man Marcus recognized from the newspapers, Senator Chen, Mrs. Chen's eldest son, who had built his political career fighting for small businesses and community preservation. "I believe," the senator said quietly, "we all have proposals to discuss." The next hour revealed truths none of them had expected. James, it turned out, had his own reservations about Lisa's methods. The development project was supposed to be about revitalization, not destruction. He produced documents showing how Lisa had gradually taken control of the project, using his connections but pursuing her own agenda. "She doesn't just want to develop the neighborhood," he admitted, She wants to erase it. Sarah listened intently, her reporter friend Rachel recording everything with permission. The story was bigger than their neighborhood now. Similar patterns had emerged in communities across the city, all tied to Lisa's corporate web. Jennifer laid out the legal implications while the senator explained the political ramifications. But it was old Joe who cut to the heart of the matter. "Your sister," he said to Marcus, "would be ashamed of what this store has become." The words hit James like a physical blow. The store had been his sister's dream first. A place where new immigrants could find their footing, where community meant something. Her death had left both James and Marcus adrift, but somewhere along the way, James had lost sight of her vision. The solution, when it finally emerged, was both simple and revolutionary. James would sell the store, not to the developers but to the community itself. The senator proposed a cooperative ownership model, with long-term residents having the first option to buy shares. The surrounding businesses would be protected under a new community trust, with legal safeguards against predatory development. But the real surprise came when James revealed his trump card. Lisa's company wasn't the only one interested in the neighborhood. A major medical research facility had been looking to expand their immunotherapy trials. "They need real communities," James explained, "not sterile corporate developments. They want to work with existing residents, not replace them." Sarah's hand found Marcus's under the counter as the implications sank in. The research facility would bring jobs, medical access, and stability to the neighborhood. More importantly, they had an immediate opening in their current trial, one that Ellen would qualify for. It wasn't charity, it was investment in the community's future. The door chimed one final time. Lisa stood there, her perfect composure cracking as she took in the scene. But before she could speak, blue and white lights filled the store windows. Jennifer's investigators had found enough evidence of corporate fraud to interest the district attorney's office. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways. As Lisa was led away, James turned to Marcus. "Your mother's recipes," he said softly. "The ones you wanted to use in your restaurant. My sister would have loved that idea." He pulled out a checkbook. "Consider it seed money for the first business in our revitalized neighborhood." Outside, the sun was rising. Community members had gathered, drawn by Rachel's discreet text messages. They watched as Sarah called Tommy with the news about their mother's treatment, as Mrs. Chin hugged her senator's son, as old Joe shared knowing looks with his fellow veterans. This wasn't just a victory against corporate greed, it was a reminder that community, real community, is built on thousands of small moments of kindness, trust, and courage. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories/videos we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. The week after Lisa's arrest passed in a blur of activity. Ellen started her immunotherapy trial, showing promising early responses that brought cautious optimism to her doctors' faces. Tommy spent hours documenting everything with his camera, his photographs now serving as official evidence in the district attorney's investigation. The images captured both the community's struggle and its triumph, from nervous shopkeepers facing intimidation to the moment the cooperative ownership papers were signed. Sarah found herself at the heart of a whirlwind. Richard withdrew his custody petition after Jennifer threatened to expose his connections to Lisa's development schemes. The cafe where she'd been working double shifts offered her a management position, complete with health insurance and flexible hours to accommodate her mother's treatments. But it was the envelope Tommy discovered in his backpack that brought her to tears. His photographs had won a city-wide competition, including a scholarship for his college education. Marcus watched the store transform as the community took ownership. The shabby shelves were replaced, the flickering lights fixed, but the soul of the place remained unchanged. Old Joe still had his morning coffee spot, now at a small cafe counter that served Marcus's mother's traditional recipes. Mrs. Chin set up a small alterations corner near the back, her skilled hands still serving the neighborhood while her son worked to pass legislation protecting other communities from corporate predators. The medical research facility brought unexpected changes. They didn't just offer trials. They opened a community health center in one of the abandoned buildings Lisa's company had acquired. Dr. Patel, freed from corporate pressure, joined their staff. The center became a model for community-based healthcare, combining Western medicine with traditional healing practices from the neighborhood's diverse cultural heritage. One quiet evening, as Marcus was closing up, Sarah appeared with 2 cups of coffee. "Tommy's exhibition opens next week," she said, settling into what had become their usual spot by the window. "He wants you to be there." Their fingers brushed as she handed him the coffee, and neither pulled away. The touch was comfortable now, familiar in a way that spoke of shared battles and growing trust. "Did you see the latest development proposals?" Marcus asked, pulling out a set of plans. The medical facility's expansion had attracted other businesses, small, community-minded operations that wanted to be part of what the press was calling the neighborhood renaissance. But this time, every proposal went through a community board. James had surprised everyone by asking to serve as an advisor, his business acumen now directed toward preservation rather than destruction. Outside, the street was alive with activity. Rachel's diner had expanded into the adjacent space, offering cooking classes taught by residents sharing their cultural recipes. The Firefighter Charity Foundation, cleared of all allegations, was running youth programs in the community center. Even the empty lot behind the store was transformed into a community garden, with Ellen supervising from her wheelchair on good days, teaching children about the healing properties of various plants. The security cameras still ran, but now they captured different stories. Old Joe mentoring troubled teens, Mrs. Chin teaching young mothers to mend clothes and build confidence, Tommy leading photography workshops for neighborhood kids. These weren't just customers anymore, they were shareholders in something bigger than a store. Sarah's mother called from the hospital, not with bad news, but to remind them about the community dinner planned for the weekend. As Sarah took the call, Marcus watched her face in the fading light. The worry lines were still there, but they were softened now by something else. Hope, perhaps, or the knowledge that burdens shared become lighter. "You know," Sarah said after hanging up, "I never thanked you properly. For that night, for everything." Marcus shook his head. "I just gave you a job. You taught me this community, you gave me back my purpose." Their eyes met in the reflection of the store window, the city lights twinkling behind them like stars. Sometimes the biggest changes in life come not from grand gestures, but from simple moments of human connection, from choosing to see the best in people and standing together when it matters most. The store's bell chimed as old Joe came in for his evening coffee. "You two about ready?" he asked with a knowing smile. "The community board meeting's about to start. We're voting on Marcus's restaurant proposal tonight." He paused at the door looking back at them. "You know, in all my years of counseling, I never saw anything quite like this neighborhood. Most people spend their lives looking for a place to belong. Sometimes you have to fight for it, sometimes you have to build it, but sometimes you just have to be brave enough to recognize it when it finds you." The morning of Tommy's photography exhibition dawned crisp and clear. Marcus stood in front of his closet, holding up the tie his Uncle James had given him. Dark blue silk with tiny silver threads catching the light. A year ago, such a gift would have felt like an obligation. Now it represented something else. Reconciliation, understanding, change. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Mom's having a good day. Doctor says the latest scan shows improvement." At the hospital, Ellen was sitting up in bed, her hair growing back in soft silver wisps. The immunotherapy was working, though progress was measured in small victories: an extra hour of energy, a full meal eaten, a walk to the garden without getting winded. Tommy fussed with his exhibition clothes while she watched with proud eyes. "Your father called," she said quietly, making both Tommy and Sarah freeze. "He wants to come to the exhibition." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Richard's attempts to gain custody had failed, but his absence still left scars. "It's your decision," Sarah told Tommy, watching her brother's face carefully. The teenager looked down at his camera, then at the photo on his laptop, the one that had won the competition. It showed the convenience store at dawn, Marcus and Sarah visible through the window, their silhouettes backlit as they worked together, unaware they were being photographed. The image captured something essential about their community: hope rising with the sun. At the gallery, the neighborhood had turned out in force. Mrs. Chin had closed her shop early, wearing a dress she'd made specially for the occasion. Old Joe came in his military dress uniform, medals gleaming. Rachel provided catering, featuring dishes inspired by Marcus's mother's recipes. The medical research facility sent representatives, including Dr. Patel, who brought news about expanding their community health programs. Tommy's photographs lined the walls, a visual history of their struggle and triumph. There was Lisa being led away in handcuffs, but also children planting flowers in the community garden. The condemned buildings now housed art spaces and health clinics. Each image told a story of transformation, not just of buildings but of people. When Richard arrived, the tension was palpable. He stood awkwardly at the entrance, expensive suit making him seem out of place among the casual community gathering. But Tommy, after a long moment, walked over to him. "Let me show you my work," he said softly. As they moved through the exhibition, Tommy's photographs spoke for him, showing the father what he had missed, the community he had abandoned, the strength his children had found without him. Marcus found Sarah watching them, her hands clenched tight. "He can't hurt you anymore," he reminded her gently. She shook her head. "It's not that. I wish he could have seen what was right in front of him all along." Marcus understood. His own relationship with James was still healing, each small step forward built on honest conversations and shared memories of his sister. The highlight of the exhibition was a series titled Night Shift, intimate portraits of the store's regular customers. Each photograph was accompanied by a story: the young mother buying formula at midnight, the college student finding refuge during exam week, the elderly couple who came in for their evening walk. These weren't just transactions, they were moments of connection, proof that community happens in the small hours and quiet spaces. Old Joe gathered everyone for a toast, his voice carrying years of wisdom. To Tommy, who showed us what we really look like. To Sarah and Marcus, who reminded us what we're worth. And to all of you, who proved that sometimes the strongest foundations are built in the hardest times. As the evening wound down, Richard approached Sarah. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like regret. "Your brother has real talent," he said awkwardly. "And you've done an amazing job with him." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was a start. Sarah felt Marcus's steady presence beside her, giving her strength to respond. "We all did," she corrected gently. "The whole community. That's something you never understood, Dad. Success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about lifting each other up, especially when things are hard." She watched understanding slowly dawn in her father's eyes as he looked around the gallery, really seeing the community for the first time. Later, as they cleaned up, Tommy showed Marcus and Sarah his next project. A documentary about the neighborhood's transformation. "I want to tell the whole story," he explained, "not just what happened but why it mattered. How one person's kindness can change everything." The three of them stood together, looking at the footage playing on Tommy's laptop. Sometimes the biggest victories aren't marked by dramatic moments, but by the quiet realization that you're exactly where you're meant to be, surrounded by exactly the right people. The news crews began arriving a week after Tommy's exhibition. His photographs had caught the attention of a major newspaper, and suddenly their neighborhood story was everywhere. Local teens' photos exposed corporate corruption. Save Community read the headlines. But it was the follow-up stories that really mattered. Pieces about community-owned businesses, affordable healthcare initiatives, and the power of grassroots organizing. Marcus watched from behind the store counter as reporters interviewed residents. Mrs. Chin spoke about immigrant entrepreneurship while hemming a dress. Old Joe shared stories of neighborhoods he'd seen destroyed by similar development schemes during his counseling years. Rachel demonstrated how her cooking classes had become cultural exchange programs. Each interview added another layer to their story, showing how community resistance could work. Sarah found herself unexpectedly thrust into a leadership role. Other neighborhoods facing similar threats began reaching out for advice. The community board meetings, once focused solely on their local issues, now included representatives from across the city. Jennifer and the senator had drafted legislation using their case as a model for protecting vulnerable communities, and Sarah was asked to testify at the city council hearings. The store itself was transformed. Marcus's small cafe counter had expanded, serving his mother's recipes alongside dishes contributed by community members. The back room, once storage for expired products under the old ownership, became a community meeting space. Photos from Tommy's exhibition lined the walls, alongside historical images of the neighborhood that older residents had contributed. Ellen's recovery continued to progress, each small victory celebrated by the entire community. On her first day walking unassisted to the store, she found a welcome party waiting. Dr. Patel was there, not as her physician but as a friend, sharing exciting news about the research facility's latest trials. The community health center had become a model program, attracting attention from medical schools interested in community-based healthcare approaches. Tommy's documentary project grew beyond his initial vision. Other young people in the neighborhood began contributing their own stories. The local high school's media program offered equipment and mentoring. Even Richard, in an unexpected turn, provided funding for professional editing software. His relationship with his children remained complicated, but he was learning, slowly, awkwardly, but sincerely, how to be present in their lives. One evening, as Sarah and Marcus closed up the store, a young woman came in looking lost and desperate. Something in her expression reminded them both of that night, nearly a year ago, when their own story began. Without hesitation, they invited her to sit at the cafe counter. Old Joe, arriving for his evening coffee, pulled up a chair. Mrs. Chin, finishing her alterations for the day, brought over tea. Rachel, delivering leftover pastries, added a plate of food. The woman's story was familiar. Medical bills, family responsibilities, corporate landlords raising rents. But this time, instead of one person offering help, an entire community was ready to respond. Tommy, setting up for an evening photography class in the meeting room, captured the moment, a group of strangers becoming neighbors, sharing resources and strength. Later that night, Sarah found Marcus in the store office, reviewing applications for the Community Trust Small Business Grant Program. James had surprised everyone by doubling the initial funding, inspired by the success of the first wave of community-owned businesses. "Remember when this was just a convenience store?" Sarah asked, settling into her usual chair. Marcus smiled, thinking of all the changes the past year had brought. "It was never just a store," he replied. "We just didn't realize it then." Outside, the neighborhood hummed with evening activity. The community garden was hosting a harvest dinner. Young people gathered for Tommy's photography class. The health center's support group was meeting in the back room. Each activity represented a thread in the complex tapestry of community life, woven stronger by shared struggle and collective triumph. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from the young woman they'd met earlier. She'd found housing through one of their community programs and was starting a job at Rachel's diner. Another small victory in their ongoing story. "You know," Sarah said, looking at the security cameras that had once caught her own moment of desperation, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone to a different store that night." Marcus took her hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Maybe someone else would have helped you," he said. "But they wouldn't have had this community behind them. That's what makes us different. That's what makes us strong." The lights of passing cars played across the store windows, each flash illuminating the photos on the walls, images of struggle, resilience, and hope, capturing the ongoing story of a community that refused to be erased. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories/videos we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. Marcus stood in the newly renovated kitchen behind the store, surrounded by the gleaming equipment James had helped him select. His mother's recipe book lay open on the counter, its pages worn and stained, filled with notes in both Chinese and English. Tomorrow would be the grand opening of his restaurant, not the fancy fusion place he'd once dreamed of, but something more meaningful, a community kitchen that would serve affordable meals while teaching cooking skills to neighborhood youth. Sarah watched him from the doorway, remembering the desperate girl she'd been a year ago. Now she was finishing her teaching certification, splitting her time between classes and managing the store's community programs. Ellen's latest scans showed the cancer in retreat, and she'd started volunteering at the health center, sharing her experience with other patients. Tommy's documentary had won a Youth Filmmaker Award, earning him early acceptance to film school. The kitchen door swung open as Rachel bustled in with a group of teenage apprentices, a program she and Marcus had developed together. Among them was the young woman they'd helped months ago, now training to become a chef herself. The smell of herbs and spices filled the air as Marcus began the evening's lesson, teaching his mother's techniques while sharing stories of her resilience as an immigrant entrepreneur. Old Joe sat at his usual spot by the window, but he wasn't alone anymore. He'd started a veteran support group that met regularly in the community space, helping others heal from their own battles. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Chin teaching a young mother to mend a torn jacket while discussing small business strategies. The alterations shop had become an informal business incubator, especially for immigrant women starting their own ventures. The medical research facility had expanded its presence, with Dr. Patel now heading a groundbreaking study on community-based healthcare delivery. Ellen was one of their success stories, but more importantly, she'd become an advocate for patient rights, working with Jennifer to challenge predatory insurance practices. The health center's waiting room displayed Tommy's photographs, reminding visitors that healing happens best in community. Sarah's father Richard had begun making awkward but sincere attempts to understand their world. He'd started attending community board meetings, listening more than speaking. While he couldn't undo the past, he was learning to support his children's choices. Today, he dropped off equipment for Tommy's media program at the high school, staying to watch his son teach younger students about documentary filmmaking. The senator's community protection bill, inspired by their story, was gaining support. James had become one of its strongest advocates, using his business connections to challenge the development practices he'd once enabled. Lisa's trial was approaching, but her corporate empire had already begun to crumble as more communities came forward with similar stories of resistance and triumph. As evening settled over the neighborhood, Marcus called Sarah into the kitchen. The apprentices had gone home, leaving them alone among the cooling ovens and clean counters. "Taste this," he said, offering her a spoonful of soup made from his mother's recipe. The familiar flavors brought tears to her eyes, not just from the spices, but from the memories of that first night, of coffee shared in darkness, of hope offered when it was needed most. "I've been thinking," Marcus said, his voice soft but sure, "about all the changes this year has brought. About how sometimes the best dreams aren't the ones we start with, but the ones we discover along the way." He reached into his pocket, then hesitated. "Your mother's feeling stronger, Tommy's future is secure, the store is thriving. I know we agreed to take things slow, to focus on the community first, but..." Sarah's heart raced as she recognized the small box in his hand. Before he could open it, the kitchen door burst open. Tommy rushed in, camera in hand, followed by Ellen in her wheelchair, old Joe with his knowing smile, Mrs. Chun clutching happy tears in her handkerchief, Rachel trying to shush the excited apprentices who'd somehow known to return. Even Richard stood awkwardly at the back, nodding encouragement to his daughter. "I wanted to do this privately," Marcus laughed, "but maybe this is better. After all, this whole journey has been about community." He opened the box, revealing a simple ring with a pattern that matched the store's original tile work. "Our story started with a late-night coffee and a chance to help. I'd like the next chapter to start here too, surrounded by the family we've built together." Sarah looked at the faces around them, her mother's joyful tears, her brother's camera capturing every moment, the community that had become so much more than neighbors. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes." The kitchen erupted in cheers, old Joe's voice rising above the rest. "Now that's what I call a good investment in the community." Outside, the store's lights glowed like a beacon in the evening darkness, just as they had that desperate night a year ago. But now they illuminated not just a convenience store but a community center, a teaching kitchen, a gathering place, a home. The security cameras still ran, but these days they captured only celebrations, proofs that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures, if we're brave enough to reach out and kind enough to help others find their way home. Wedding preparations transformed the entire neighborhood into a bustling workshop of love and creativity. Mrs. Chen's alterations shop became a bridal atelier, with her skilled hands crafting Sarah's dress from vintage lace and silk. The design incorporated subtle elements from both their cultures, Chinese embroidery meeting Western elegance, just as their lives had intertwined. Local seamstresses gathered to help, turning the project into an informal masterclass for aspiring designers. The community kitchen doubled as a test kitchen for the wedding feast. Marcus and Rachel led a team of their cooking students in experimenting with fusion recipes that honored both families' traditions. Ellen, whose strength grew with each passing day, sat at the tasting table offering suggestions, her medical knowledge surprisingly useful in balancing flavors and dietary needs. The young apprentices competed to create the perfect wedding dessert, their efforts documented by Tommy's ever-present camera. Old Joe had taken charge of transforming the store's community space for the ceremony. His veterans group volunteered their time, working alongside high school students to restore the original architectural details they discovered beneath years of renovations. Each uncovered molding and restored tile told part of the neighborhood's story, a history that would now include this celebration of love and renewal. The wedding planning sessions in the back room often turned into impromptu community meetings. While discussing flower arrangements, they'd end up strategizing about expanding the community garden. Conversations about seating charts led to plans for new mentorship programs. Even the guest list became a catalyst for connection, as residents reached out to former neighbors who'd been displaced by previous development projects, inviting them to return and see how the community had transformed. Sarah found herself in the middle of a documentary storm. Tommy's film about the neighborhood's transformation had caught the attention of a major streaming service, and they wanted to include the wedding as part of their series on community revival. But it was the local coverage that touched her most, student journalists from Tommy's media program interviewing residents about how the store had changed their lives, each story a testament to the power of small kindnesses multiplied. One evening, as Sarah reviewed RSVPs at the store counter, her father Richard arrived with an unexpected gift, a letter from her former principal offering her a teaching position at her old school. The timing would allow her to start after the honeymoon, and the schedule would work around her community commitments. I may have mentioned to some board members how the store's education programs have improved student performance, Richard admitted, showing how far he'd come in supporting his daughter's chosen path. Marcus, meanwhile, faced his own surprise when James and his sister's old friends from Taiwan arrived early for the wedding. They brought with them a treasure trove of family recipes and photographs, including images of the store in its earliest days. Among them was a picture of Marcus's mother and sister standing proudly in front of the newly opened shop, their dreams for the future shining in their eyes. The photo found a place of honor on the wall, a reminder that legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Dr. Patel and the medical research team had their own wedding gift, news that the successful community healthcare model they developed would be implemented in cities nationwide. Ellen's case had been instrumental in proving that combining medical treatment with community support led to better outcomes. The health center would be expanded, with a new wing dedicated to integrative medicine and cultural healing practices. The senator arrived one afternoon with Jennifer and a film crew from C-SPAN. The community protection bill had passed, and they wanted to showcase the neighborhood as an example of successful resistance and revival. But more importantly, he came as Mrs. Chen's son, proudly watching his mother teach a new generation of immigrant entrepreneurs how to build their dreams while maintaining their cultural identity. As the big day approached, the young woman they'd helped months ago, now a successful apprentice chef, asked to make their wedding cake. Her design would tell their story in sugar and flour, a convenience store counter where two lives changed course, surrounded by tiny details representing each person who'd become part of their journey. "You gave me more than a job," she explained, sketching her ideas. "You showed me that sometimes rock bottom is just a foundation for building something better." The security cameras captured it all, the late-night decorating sessions, the impromptu dance practices, the quiet moments when Sarah and Marcus would pause in their preparations to share a coffee at their spot by the window. Each frame proved that their love story had never been just about two people, but about an entire community learning to believe in second chances and new beginnings. Old Joe, watching the preparations from his usual seat, summed it up best. "You know what makes this wedding special? It's not just two people promising to share a future. It's a whole community renewing its vows to take care of each other. Now that's something worth celebrating." Dawn broke over the neighborhood with an almost magical quality, golden light touching the store's restored facade where fairy lights still twinkled from the night before. The community garden had spilled its bounty onto the sidewalks, pots of flowers creating an impromptu pathway between the store, the health center, and the newly renovated community space where the ceremony would take place. The air was rich with the scent of fresh bread from Marcus's kitchen, where his apprentices had been working since midnight, determined to make every detail perfect. Sarah stood in Mrs. Chen's shop, watching her reflection in the antique mirror as the master seamstress made final adjustments to her dress. Ellen sat nearby, radiant in her mother-of-the-bride outfit, her recovery evident in the color in her cheeks and the strength in her smile. Tommy moved around them with his camera, but for once he wasn't filming for his documentary. "This is just for us," he said softly, capturing the moment his sister transformed from survivor to bride. In the store's back office, Marcus found a moment of quiet with James and old Joe. His uncle pressed a small box into his hands. Inside was a jade pendant that had belonged to Marcus's mother. "She would have been proud," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just of the man you've become, but of what you've helped build here." Old Joe, resplendent in his dress uniform, added his own gift to a bound collection of letters from community members, each sharing how the store had changed their lives. The ceremony space took everyone's breath away. The veterans group and students had outdone themselves, restoring the original ceiling murals and installing vintage chandeliers found in the building's basement. Photos from Tommy's exhibition lined the walls, telling the story of their journey from that desperate night to this joyful day. The community health center's patients had contributed a handmade quilt as an altar backdrop, each square representing a story of healing and hope. As guests arrived, they were greeted by the young people from the store's mentorship program, proudly wearing aprons embroidered by Mrs. Chen's sewing circle. Rachel's cooking students served appetizers that fused cultural traditions, xiaolong bao filled with unexpected Mediterranean flavors, pasta sauced with Chinese herbs, each bite a celebration of unity and diversity. Dr. Patel arrived with exciting news. Ellen's latest test showed no trace of cancer. The timing felt like a blessing, a reminder that sometimes the darkest nights really do lead to the brightest dawns. The health center staff celebrated quietly with Ellen, their relationship long since evolved from medical to familial. Richard's entrance caused a momentary hush. He looked almost shy as he approached Sarah, his usual corporate polish replaced by genuine emotion. "Your mother and I married in a fancy hotel," he said, looking around the transformed community space. "But this is real beauty?" For the first time, his daughter saw him truly understanding the richness of the life she'd chosen. The ceremony itself was a tapestry of traditions and innovations. Old Joe officiated, his counselor's wisdom adding depth to the standard vows. The young chef who'd become their first success story played the violin, her music weaving together melodies from both their heritage. The store's regular customers, now shareholders in their community enterprise, stood witness to the union of two people whose love had helped save their neighborhood. When Marcus and Sarah exchanged rings, they stood on the exact spot where she had first asked him for a job. The security cameras that had captured that desperate moment now recorded their kiss, their tears of joy, the explosion of celebration from a community that had become family. Tommy's camera caught it all, the way Ellen beamed with pride, how Mrs. Chin dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief, the sight of Richard and James standing together, two men learning that it's never too late to choose a better path. Sarah and Marcus's love story had become part of the neighborhood's legacy, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest choices. Their marriage wasn't just a union of two people, but a symbol of what could happen when hope overcame fear, when community conquered isolation, when love proved stronger than despair. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to pass on the kindness that had saved them both on that desperate night so long ago. 1 year after the wedding, Tommy stood on a stage at his high school graduation, delivering a valedictorian speech that brought the audience to tears. His words weren't just about academic achievement, they were about community, resilience, and the power of everyday heroes. The documentary he'd created had won numerous awards, but more importantly, it had inspired similar projects in struggling neighborhoods across the country. As he spoke, his camera sat ready to capture this milestone, another chapter in their ongoing story. Sarah watched from the audience, her hand instinctively moving to her growing belly. The baby wasn't planned, but like everything else in their journey, it felt right. The entire neighborhood had celebrated the news, with Mrs. Chun already working on traditional baby clothes and the community kitchen planning healthy meals for after the birth. The education center would soon add a childcare program, turning another community need into an opportunity for growth. Marcus had expanded the store's model to other neighborhoods, working with James to create a network of community-owned businesses. Each location adapted the concept to fit local needs, but the core remained the same, combining commerce with compassion, turning transaction points into transformation opportunities. The original store remained their flagship, its security cameras still recording daily moments of kindness and connection. Ellen's recovery had become a symbol of hope at the health center. She now led support groups for cancer patients and their families, sharing not just her medical journey but the story of community healing. Dr. Patel's research on the connection between social support and medical outcomes had revolutionized treatment approaches, with medical schools sending students to learn from their integrated care model. Richard's redemption arc continued to surprise everyone. After witnessing the impact of community-based business, he'd started a foundation supporting similar initiatives in underserved areas. His relationship with his children had deepened through shared purpose, and he'd become a regular fixture at community events, often bringing corporate contacts who could support their various programs. The apprentice chef who'd made their wedding cake now ran a successful bakery in the neighborhood, training other young people in both culinary arts and business skills. Her creations regularly appeared in food magazines, each design telling a story of community and hope. The wedding cake that had started it all remained immortalized in photographs, a sugar-crafted testament to the power of second chances. Old Joe's Veterans Group had become a national model, with similar programs sprouting up across the country. He still held court by the store window, but now people came from far and wide to seek his wisdom. The community space where he'd counseled so many had been officially named in his honor, though he insisted the real honor was in the lives changed within its walls. Lisa's story took an unexpected turn. After her release, she approached the community with a proposal, using her business expertise to help other neighborhoods resist predatory development. Jennifer helped her establish a consulting firm specializing in community preservation, turning her former tactics into tools for protection. Her redemption wasn't easy or complete, but it proved that change was possible at any stage. The security cameras captured a special moment one evening, Sarah and Marcus showing their wedding video to a group of young entrepreneurs. The footage wasn't just about their celebration, it was about the power of community to transform lives. As they watched, A young woman in the audience wiped away tears, recognizing her own story of desperation and renewal in their journey. Tommy's graduation party spilled out of the store into the street, becoming another impromptu community celebration. His college acceptance letters had come with scholarships, but more importantly, they'd come with opportunities to study community development and documentary filmmaking. His next project would focus on similar transformations happening in other neighborhoods, proving that their model could work anywhere people were willing to choose compassion over convenience. As the sun set on the celebration, Sarah and Marcus stood in their usual spot by the window. The store had changed so much since that first desperate night, new programs, new faces, new hope radiating from every corner. But its heart remained the same. A place where kindness could change the course of lives, where community meant more than commerce, where love could spark a revolution of compassion. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with life. The community garden bloomed with summer flowers, the health center's lights glowed with healing purpose, and Mrs. Chen's shop rang with the laughter of apprentice seamstresses learning their craft. Each location marked a point in their shared story, a reminder that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the smallest steps, and the deepest changes start with a simple choice to help another soul in need. On a quiet evening 5 years after that first desperate night, Sarah stood behind the store counter, her young daughter Maya perched on a stool beside her, helping stock the shelves. The security cameras that had once caught her mother's moment of desperation now recorded Maya's delighted giggles as she arranged candy bars with serious concentration. At 4, she was already a neighborhood favorite, equally at home in Mrs. Chen's sewing circle, Rachel's kitchen, or Old Joe's storytelling sessions. The store had become a model studied by urban planners and community organizers worldwide. Bus tours of community activists would stop by, hoping to understand how one convenience store had sparked a revolution of compassion. But the real answer couldn't be captured in their notebooks or photographs. It lived in the daily moments of connection, in the choice to see beyond transactions to the human stories behind them. Tommy, now in his final year of film school, had returned to premiere his latest documentary. This one tracked how their neighborhood's model had inspired similar transformations across the country. The community space was packed for the screening, with familiar faces from their journey mixed with visitors from other neighborhoods seeking their own renewal. Ellen, now 5 years cancer-free, sat in the front row, her volunteer coordinator badge from the health center reflecting the light. Marcus stood at the back, bouncing their 6-month-old son Daniel on his hip. The community kitchen next door hummed with activity as his apprentices prepared for tomorrow's cooking class. The program had grown beyond his wildest dreams, launching dozens of successful food entrepreneurs who carried his mother's recipes and his lessons about community to their own neighborhoods. Richard and James sat together, 2 men humbled and transformed by witnessing the power of community. Richard's foundation had helped establish similar programs in 20 other neighborhoods, while James had become a leading voice for ethical urban development. Even Lisa, who'd served her time and dedicated herself to community preservation, had found a way to contribute to the change she'd once fought against. Old Joe's wisdom had been compiled into a book about community building, though he still insisted the best lessons happened over coffee at his regular spot. The veterans program he'd started had spread nationwide, healing hearts and building bridges one conversation at a time. His daughter Jennifer had helped draft legislation protecting other communities from predatory development, ensuring their story would have lasting impact. Dr. Patel's research on community-based healthcare had revolutionized medical education. The health center's model had been replicated in hundreds of locations, each one adapting the core principle that healing happens best in community. Ellen's support groups had grown into a national network, turning cancer patients into advocates for community care. As the sun set on another day of small miracles and quiet transformations, Sarah gathered everyone for a special announcement. The education center was expanding again, this time to include a scholarship program for students committed to community development. The first recipient would be the daughter of that young woman they'd helped years ago, the one who'd gone from desperate visitor to successful chef to community leader herself. The security cameras recorded it all, just as they had on that first night. But now they captured something more precious than merchandise. They recorded proof that hope could multiply, that kindness could ripple outward endlessly, that one moment of compassion could transform not just a life or a neighborhood, but an entire way of thinking about community and connection. Maya tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing to a new family lingering uncertainly by the door. Refugees recently arrived in the neighborhood. Without hesitation, the entire community mobilized, just as they had so many times before. Mrs. Chin approached with warm welcomes and offers of practical help. Rachel emerged from the kitchen with fresh bread. Old Joe pulled up chairs for everyone. The cycle of kindness continued, proving that the true measure of a community isn't its wealth or its buildings, but its capacity to welcome, support, and transform lives. As night fell, Sarah and Marcus stood at their usual spot by the window, watching their children play in a neighborhood that had become so much more than they'd ever dreamed. The security cameras caught their reflection, 5 years older but infinitely richer in all the ways that mattered. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. To help instead of judge, to build instead of break, to see the humanity in each person who walks through the door. And that's the real story of the convenience store that became a community center, of the desperate night that became a new dawn, of the small kindness that sparked a revolution of compassion. It's a reminder that every moment offers us a choice, to turn away or to reach out, to give up or to lift up, to accept the darkness or to light another candle against it. Because in the end, we're all just walking through each other's lives, leaving footprints on each other's hearts. And sometimes, in the simple act of helping another soul find their way home, we find our own path to something greater than ourselves.